Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into something fundamental, something that, well, it feels like it defines the modern age, doesn't it?
It really does.
Why are we all so desperately searching for meaning?
Yeah.
For centuries, people didn't even ask that, not in the way we do, but now it drives whole industries, wellness, self-help, philosophy, you name it.
It's everywhere.
So we're not just going to summarize this crisis. We want to dive deep into a clash, really, a profound psychological and philosophical clash between two major ways of thinking about this.
That's the plan. We're filtering this whole meaning crisis through two distinct lenses. On one hand, you've got traditional Jungian thought, the idea of transformation, the mythic quest.
Finding yourself, the hero's journey kind of thing.
Exactly. And on the other hand, there's this really critical, almost challenging framework from Wolfgang Giegerich.
And his view is pretty different.
Radically different. He basically suggests that the search itself, the thing we think is the cure, is actually the biggest symptom of our historical problem.
Wow, okay. So we need to figure out, is this yearning for meaning, this search, is it a genuine call from the soul, like the Jungians might say?
Or is it, as Giegerich implies, maybe just a kind of neurotic defense, a way to avoid facing a perhaps uncomfortable historical truth?
To even get started, we have to unpack a key concept Giegerich uses. It's a Spanish term, adentridad.
Adentridad.
It sounds central to this whole debate. Can you break that down for us? What does it mean, and why is it so crucial here?
Right, adentridad. Literally, it's like inwardness, but that doesn't quite capture it in this context. Think embeddedness or containment.
Containment in life.
Exactly, containment in life. It describes this sort of primordial state, maybe even unconscious, where existence just is. It's self-evident, it's grounded, you don't question it.
So if you have a dentridad, you're not asking what's the meaning of life.
Precisely. The question doesn't even arise because the meaning is just woven into the fabric of your being. It's just there, implicit.
So the modern meaning crisis isn't about finding a new answer.
It's about the loss, the catastrophic loss of this fundamental containment. And the whole debate we're looking at really hinges on when and how Western consciousness, well, lost this embeddedness. Giegerich points specifically to the period after the 19th century.
Okay.
And then the big question is, what do we do now? Logically, psychologically, where do we go from here?
Giegerich's thesis sounds, frankly, quite aggressive on this. If the search isn't the remedy, but the disease itself, that turns everything on its head.
Completely. It flips the whole therapeutic goal.
So what does that imply about all our modern angst, our existential anxieties?
It implies our efforts might be, well, futile, because they're pointed in the wrong direction. Giegerich is basically arguing that the feeling of loss, the emptiness, and the compulsive search that follows, they're all just different faces of the same historical break.
So you can't fix it with a personal solution.
You can't solve a historical, structural, almost logical shift with a purely personal psychological answer. The problem isn't really in you personally. It's in the structure of consciousness itself, historically speaking.
Okay, but then you look at Jung and Jungian psychology, especially in practice. Isn't the loss of connection, this adentridad, isn't that seen as the necessary push, the thing that starts the journey?
Absolutely. That's the counter-narrative.
The journey of individuation, finding the self. So is the Jungian idea just that we need to search harder or differently?
It's maybe subtler than just search harder, but it's definitely more optimistic about the psyche's potential. For the Jungian tradition, losing that primal containment isn't the end of the story. It's a necessary stage.
A developmental stage.
Yeah, a stage in the development of consciousness. It's seen as a call towards a new kind of symbolic life. That emptiness isn't a dead end to be accepted. It's the crucible where transformation happens.
So the unconscious demands something.
It demands personal work, transformative work, often a kind of mythological confrontation with the deeper self. So from this perspective, you absolutely shouldn't stop searching. You need to deepen the search, recognizing that engaging with the symbolic is the only truly authentic response to our modern, often quite mechanical existence.
All right, let's dig deeper into Giegerich's definition of meaning, because it really pushes against how we usually talk about it. He insists it's not a thing you find, not a belief system, not an ideology, not even just a feeling.
Yeah, he completely strips it of semantic content, meaning for him, isn't something about life, it's an implicit fact of existence. It's a priori.
A priori meaning, it comes before experience, before thought even.
Exactly. Think of it as an unconditional premise, like the ground you stand on. It's this indisputable and unquestionable certainty that exists before you could even formulate a question about it.
So trying to analyze it would be pointless.
It would be nonsensical if you were truly in it, like trying to analyze the concept of existence while you're, existing. It's the groundwork itself, that feeling of being utterly grounded.
Which brings us to his famous metaphor, the fish in the water. We should probably spend a moment here.
Definitely. This metaphor is really the cornerstone of his perspective.
Okay, unpack it for us.
Giegerich argues that the meaning of life, or rather the sense of meaning, used to be as self-evident and unquestioned as the water is to the fish. The water provides total containment. That's the identridad.
The fish doesn't question the water.
Right. Does the fish ask, what's the meaning of water? Or do I need to go searching for water? Of course not. The water is just the absolute non-thematic condition of its entire life.
So if the fish did start asking that
would mean something profound had already changed. It would mean the fish had somehow developed a consciousness capable of standing outside the water, even just conceptually for a moment. And Giegerich says, we humans, we used to be that fish.
living within the water of meaning, unquestioningly.
Yes, until we weren't anymore.
So looking back at history, ancient myths, religions, medieval philosophy, all the way up to, say, Hegel or Schelling, those incredibly complex systems weren't attempts to answer the question, is life worth living, like William James might ask.
Giegerich says absolutely not. They weren't answers because the question itself, in our modern sense, didn't exist yet.
So what were they then?
They were the concrete expressions, the formulaciones concretas, as the Spanish text puts it, of the inherent logic and the lived identidad of existence for that time. They weren't trying to fill a void or solve a problem.
They were just articulating the reality they lived in.
Exactly. Expressing and celebrating the truth as they experienced it, the embeddedness they felt. Think about the ancient Egyptians and the pyramids.
Yeah, the sheer scale is mind-boggling.
That wasn't, a calculated response to some psychological need for meaning in our sense. Giegerich would see it as a physical manifestation of their dedication metaphysica, their absolute absorption within a larger cosmic spiritual whole. Human life was contained, integrated within that structure.
Okay, that paints a picture of a very different way of being, which sets up this radical historical break that Giegerich identifies. He places it around the 19th century.
Yeah, roughly post-19th century, coinciding with industrialization, the rise of scientific materialism, a certain kind of radical rationalism taking hold.
And why did the question of meaning suddenly become so urgent then?
Because, he argues, a radical change occurred in humanity's fundamental mode of being in the world. Consciousness itself evolved or shifted. It shifted to a position where it could step outside of its previous absolute containment, the previo y absoluto contenimiento. Man, or consciousness, stepped back and looked at existence.
So existence became an object, something separate.
Precisely. Instead of being lived seamlessly from within, existence was suddenly viewed enfrente de la conciencia, standing opposite consciousness, an object to be examined, questioned, critiqued. The world became thematic, problematic, only because the observer was no longer fully immersed within it.
Let's talk about the consequences of that break. Giegerich uses this really striking image. Atlas lost his job.
Yeah, it's powerful.
Atlas holding up the sky, the structure of the cosmos. What collapsed when he metaphorically retired?
It was the collapse of that essential duality that structured reality. In the traditional worldview, there was always a vertical axis. Heaven and earth, the sacred and the profane, the universal and the particular. These weren't just abstract ideas. They were felt as structural realities that provided meaning and containment.
So when Atlas drops the sky?
That vertical dimension disappears. The essential duality collapses. The world becomes singular, flat, purely physical perhaps, subject only to scientific positivist inquiry. And crucially, the universals also vanish.
Universals like Plato's forms,
Yeah.
or Neoplatonic concepts.
Exactly. Those big defining archetypal ideas like man with a capital M or woman, justice, beauty. These concepts used to provide the overarching framework that defined the individual instance.
And if the universal concept of man disappears, what happens to me, the individual man or woman?
You become emancipated in a sense, free,
Yeah.
but also structurally homeless. Before, your meaning came, in part, from participating in that universal concept. You were an instance of man. Now, without that overarching universal, the only reality is the concrete de facto individual. You are just.
You. So the individual is forced to define themselves from scratch.
Yes. Detached from any pre-given higher framework. And that, for Giegerich, is the origin of modern identity anxiety. We're simultaneously free to be anything, which sounds great.
But also terrifying.
Terrifying because we're defined by nothing external, nothing certain, nothing transcendent. The crisis of meaning is essentially the psychological, existential echo of that metaphysical sky falling. It was a necessary, logical evolution of consciousness in his view, but the price was losing that effortless identidad.
Okay, this leads directly into what might be Giegerich's most provocative, even brutal insight. The idea that the search for meaning, the thing we do to fix the problem, is actually self-defeating. A vicious cycle.
It is. It's a core part of his critique.
How does yearning for meaning actually create more meaninglessness? That sounds paradoxical.
Because the very act of searching positions meaning as something missing, something outside of your current existence. The feeling of loss and the active search for meaning, the supposed cure, are, for Giegerich, two sides of the exact same coin. They are functionally identical expressions of the historical break.
So the moment I start looking for meaning,
You are implicitly defining your current life,
right,
right here and now, as inherently lacking that meaning, as lesser, empty, incomplete. Banal is a word he often uses.
so the more desperately I search for some grand external truth or purpose.
The more trivial and senseless your actual day-to-day reality starts to feel by comparison. The yearning itself guarantees that life as it is lived is perpetually viewed as not enough, nothing secure, maybe just fleeting illusion, Maya. The search is the act of devaluing the present.
Wow. So by trying to find meaning, we inadvertently reinforce the structure of a meaningless reality. And he talks about this being amplified by what he calls the illusion of the market.
Yes, the market of meanings. We've essentially industrialized this existential hunger.
Wow.
Well, think about what we're truly yearning for deep down. It's that irrevocable identidad, right? That sense of unchosen fundamental belonging. But the act of searching, by definition, requires you to stand outside to look for something.
Okay.
This externalized search inevitably treats meaning as if it were a product. A semantic content, a commodity, a belief system, a lifestyle choice, a good of consumption.
Something you can shop for, acquire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like buying a new philosophy, or joining a group, or adopting a wellness practice. Meaning becomes a subscription almost.
And what's the consequence of having this huge market of meanings, this industry of meanings, selling all these options?
The consequence is fragmentation and an inherent lack of grounding. When meaning is marketed, you get countless competing truths. Spiritual gurus, political ideologies, self-help programs, conspiracy theories, whatever.
A pluralism of meaning?
Right. But even if you buy one, if you choose a doctrine or a community, it immediately feels fragile. Why? Because you chose it.
Ah, so it's a secondary acquisition.
Yes. It's like renting a house instead of being born into your ancestral home. The original identidad was your unchosen inherent place, this chosen meaning. The consumer, the modern individual, always knows, deep down, they could return the commodity, switch ideologies, cancel the subscription.
Which just reinforces the feeling that the meaning is contingent, not absolute.
Precisely. It ultimately reinforces the underlying sense of meaninglessness it was supposed to cure.
Which then leads to this other really difficult point he makes, the intolerable truth, the great irony. We say we suffer from losing this total containment, this identidad.
But if we actually found it, if we were suddenly plunged back into that kind of absolute, unquestionable meaning,
We hate it.
we'd find it utterly intolerable, terrifying even.
Why?
Because the modern subject, the modern ego, fiercely insists on its rationalidad libre, its free rationality, its emancipated individuality, its right to question everything.
We value critical thinking, autonomy.
Exactly. So the moment that individual felt themselves being subsumed, completely contained by an absolute, unquestionable meaning structure, it would immediately be perceived as imprisonment.
It's like being trapped.
Yes. And you see reflections of this historically, right?
Yeah.
Our deep-seated anxiety about totalitarian regimes or fundamentalist religious sects, places where individual choice and critical reason are dissolved into a collective, absolute meaning. We might crave the security of that kind of belonging on some level.
But we insist on the freedom to walk away.
We insist on the intellectual freedom
Yeah.
to criticize and reject that security the moment it feels too binding, too absolute. It's a fundamental contradiction in the modern position.
Okay, so if the search is the symptom, and the goal we think we want, total containment, is actually intolerable to our modern consciousness, what is the way forward according to Giegerich? How do we stop this cycle?
Through what he calls logical integration. It's not about finding something new or going back.
Logical integration.
He argues that the suffering, the addiction to the search, will only truly disappear if the loss itself is fully accepted. Allowed to. Well, to infect and penetrate the very syntax of consciousness itself. It's a transformation logica, a logical transformation.
Okay, what does that mean practically? Infect the syntax of consciousness.
It means stop trying to resurrect the old gods or find external authorities or universal ideas out there. Instead, we need to recognize that the historical task of those old forms, religion, mythology, metaphysics, is actually fulfilled. Done.
Fulfilled.
I feel lost.
Fulfilled in the sense that their essential content has been absorbed into us. He uses this metaphor, the sugar cube, der onde Zucker, dissolving into coffee.
Okay.
Think about it. The objective contents of the past, the gods, the Platonic ideas, and universal concepts, they were like that solid sugar cube through a historical process, which he links to Hegel's idea of sublation.
Sublation. It's like sublimation, but more complex. Absorption and transcendence. Exactly. It's absorbed, preserved, but also transcended. That solid, objective content the sugar cube has dissolved into consciousness, into the coffee. It's disappeared as a visible external object you can point to.
But the coffee is now sweet?
Precisely. You can no longer see the sugar cube, but its quality, the sweetness, is now present throughout the solution. It's become an inherent quality of the coffee.
So the gods, the old meanings, they haven't vanished without a trace. They've become qualities or categories within our own modern thinking.
That's the idea. Gods have become memories. Mnemosyne, the Greek goddess of memory. But not just passive memories. They've become the logical structures, the categories through which we now think. They're obsolete as external objects, not because they were false, but because their logical and structural job is done. Their content is now inside, as subjective structures of the modern mind.
So trying to go back to literal myths or expecting encounters with gods as external beings
Is, in this view, a logical error, a misunderstanding of history. It's trying to undissolve the sugar. It's regressive because it denies the actual evolution of consciousness.
So the task is what? Intellectual humility.
Sort of. It's to accept the logical structure of consciousness as it is now, and to live within the categories we have forged categories, which are, in fact, the dissolved residue of those ancient gods and ideas. It's about working with the logic of the present, not nostalgically trying to recapture a past form of containment.
Wow. Okay, that is a really powerful, coherent, and maybe somewhat cold historical analysis. It demands a kind of rigorous acceptance.
It does. It has a certain stoic quality, perhaps.
But the Jungian perspective, it just fundamentally rejects this idea that the spiritual, the numinous, has been neatly tidied away into logical categories, right?
Completely rejects it. If Giegerich represents the voice of historical logos, the Jungian view champions the ongoing, often irrational vitality of the seek, the soul.
So how does the Jungian tradition respond to this idea of fulfillment and obsolescence? What's their take on the loss?
Well, thinkers in the Jungian lineage, like Ortega and Gasset in some interpretations, fundamentally disagree with Giegerich's premise that meaning itself is lost or fulfilled. The traditional Jungian view, or one strong strand of it, is more like no se ha perdido ningún significado sentido, meaning, or sense hasn't been lost. Lo que se ha perdido es el vínculo. The vínculo. The link, the bond. Yes, the vital link, the connection, the feeling of belonging to the totality. Meaning still exists, the archetypal realities are still potent, but the modern individual is cut off, disconnected from that stream.
So the loss isn't a historical endpoint.
No, it's a necessary challenge. It's a crisis that forces consciousness to confront the limitations, maybe even the mechanical error, of relying solely on the rational, external, modern way of being.
And this leads directly to the core critique against Giegerich, doesn't it? That his whole perspective is just too intellectualized.
That's absolutely the heart of the conflict. The accusation is that Giegerich reduces the dynamic living reality of the soul, the spiritual dimension, to just a function of thought, a categoria logica.
Which, for a Jungian, misses the whole point about archetypes.
Exactly. Because archetypes in the Jungian understanding are not just abstract logical concepts or pretty poetic metaphors. They are seen as possessing a genuine, current, and efficacious energy.
They're forces, living patterns.
Yes, forces, patterns of instinct and image deep within the collective unconscious, and they demand expression. They demand to be lived, experienced. So the critique is that Giegerich relies too heavily, perhaps solely, on rationalidad, on dialectical logic.
And ignores the felt reality.
And ignores the profound, often messy, sometimes terrifying, but undeniably experiential reality of the unconscious. You know, you can logically categorize water all day long, but you still have to drink it, experience it, to survive.
There's that famous Jungian anecdote that really brings this clash into sharp focus, the story of the woman who traveled constantly, the daughter of the moon.
Yes, that's a classic illustration of the difference.
Yeah.
Jung describes meeting this woman who is just constantly moving, restlessly traveling, searching, buscando.
And her life felt empty despite all the movement.
He described her life as totally, grotesquely banal. Her frantic external search was a symptom of a deep inner emptiness, a lack of symbolic connection. Jung saw her as neurotic not because she was traveling, but because she failed to grasp the deeper symbolic imperative behind her compulsion.
And Jung's proposed cure wasn't just stop traveling, it was symbolic.
Right. It was to give her a mythological role, a connection to something larger. He suggested that if she could embrace a symbolic truth, if she could genuinely feel and say, I am the daughter of the moon, I must travel to help my mother, the moon, journey across the horizon, then her life would gain that crucial symbolic dimension, the vita symbolica.
So the compulsion becomes meaningful.
The compulsion transforms from a meaningless symptom into a profound necessary task. And that transformation is the essence of much Jungian therapeutic work, turning the lead of the symptom into the gold of the symbol.
But from the Giegerichian standpoint, people like Eskenazi who follow his line of thought, this cure is anything but. It's seen as, well, self-delusion, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. They would see that as a repetition of the illness, not a cure. An impossible attempt to regress, to restore a personality structure based on an archaic mythological framework that history and the evolution of consciousness have logically left behind.
An imitation of something no longer real.
Exactly. Eskenazi's imagined response is blunt. If Giegerich had met her, he would have simply said, Marchese ya a casa, no busque más que no hay. Go home. Stop searching. Because the thing you're looking for, that primal myth of containment in that old form, it just doesn't exist like that anymore.
So faced with that stark dismissal, how does the Jungian tradition defend the validity of the search? If the old gods are memories and the old containment is gone, why isn't this push to become a magical being just a neurotic fantasy, a defense mechanism?
Because for the Jungian, the unconscious isn't just a historical relic or a collection of dissolved concepts. It's a vital, living source of energy and wisdom right now.
It's still active.
Always active. The argument is that the neurotic individual often falls ill precisely because their conscious ego tries to live solely within the rational, scientific, disenchanted worldview, believing it can provide all the satisfaction needed. This leads to a profound starvation of the soul.
And the unconscious reacts.
The unconscious, driven by the archetype of the self. The organizing principle, aiming for wholeness, pushes back. It pushes the individual towards becoming, metaphorically, that magical being. Hara ofano. This isn't just about nostalgia. It's a symbolic representation of the self and its inherent teleological direction.
Teleological meaning it's aiming for a future goal, not just looking backward.
Exactly. Impulso hacia el porvenir, no el pasado. An impulse towards the future, not the past. The psychic energy, the libido, is always striving toward individuation, towards wholeness, towards transformation. Finding or creating this personal myth, this symbolic meaning, isn't seen as a subjective fantasy. It's viewed as a necessary confrontation with the fundamental, non-negotiable realities of the deep psyche.
So the search for the mythic isn't regression.
It's the soul's deepest imperative to become whole, regardless of whether historical logic says the symbols are fulfilled or obsolete. The energy demands engagement.
Okay, so this really boils down to a fundamental disagreement about where the primary reality of spiritual life resides. Is it in history, the horizontal axis of cultural evolution, as Giegerich seems to emphasize?
Right, the historical unfolding of the logos.
Or is it in the timeless, unchanging structure of the psyche, the vertical axis connecting us to the archetypes, as the Jungians stress?
Precisely. Let's look again at Giegerich on the death of symbols and sublation.
Okay. He argues they died because their meaning was successfully abstracted and integrated.
Yes. Abstracted, pulled out, and integrated into the logical structure of the modern mind through that Hegelian process of sublation. Because the logic that the gods once embodied is now supposedly an inherent part of how we think, the original symbols become historical memories, mnemosyne. They're fulfilled, their task is done, they're obsolete. For him, the laboratory of the soul is history itself. The soul progresses objectively through cultural shifts.
But the Jungian critique is that this laser focus on sublation and Western historical development completely ignores vast swaths of spiritual tradition, right? The perennial philosophy.
Exactly. They criticize Giegerich for focusing almost exclusively on history and sociology as the stage for the soul, what philosophers might call the res extensa, the extended, measurable external world. This neglects the vertical axis, the res cogitans in a broader sense perhaps,
The inner world.
the inner world, and the timeless dimension. The esoteric traditions, which deeply inform Jungian thought, maintain the idea of a perennial philosophy, that the core archetypal realities are always present, always active, always vigorous, regardless of how a particular culture at a particular time formulates them.
So a specific God image might die in the public square.
But the underlying archetypal energy doesn't disappear. It remains potent and simply demands a new vessel, a new symbolic expression, often found in the inner transformative journey, the esoteric path, not just the exoteric historical one.
This also shows up in the different tools they prioritize for navigating modern life. Giegerich emphasizing logos thinking.
Yes, Giegerich and his followers emphasize new objective intelligence, reason, and pensamento rigorous thinking as the essential, even superior tools for dealing with modern reality. The solution for them has to be primarily logical and objective, aligned with the historical phase of consciousness.
And they're critical of focusing too much on the personal soul.
Very critical. They tend to view the intense focus on the subjective personal soul. My destiny, my inner child, me Saturno, my Saturn, in astrology, as potentially falling into ego psychology or the fallacia the anthropological fallacy.
Meaning what? Mistaking personal feelings for objective truth.
Kind of. The idea is that the soul, or psyche in its objective sense, isn't in the individual ego. The individual ego is in the larger objective soul, which unfolds historically. So the task isn't endless personal introspection, but for the individual ego to logically grasp and align with the objective movement of the historical logos.
Okay, how does the Jungian perspective counter that dismissal of the personal?
Well, Jungians, often drawing on critiques like Ortega's, insist that you simply cannot artificially separate the objective mind, res cogitans, from the individual's lived experience, the yo me conmigo, the I'm am I with me. Consciousness is interpretation, it is subjective experience.
You can't get outside your own perspective entirely.
Exactly. And Giegerich's attempt to study the objective soul primarily through culture and history is seen as inherently partial, incomplete, maybe overly extroverted. For the Jungian, the individual's inner solitude, their subjective struggle, isn't a narcissistic dead end to be overcome by logic.
It's the doorway.
It's la puerta, the necessary doorway, the threshold to encountering the higher world, the objective psyche, the logos itself. The integration happens in the individual's personal crucible. You can't bypass the subjective path just by analyzing history.
Let's shift slightly to a more maybe ethical or behavioral critique that seems present in the Giegerichian view. How do they see the typical modern Western individual? They sound pretty critical.
Yes, there's often a strong critique there. The Giegerichian analysis frequently portrays the modern subject as fundamentally narcissistic, stuck in what they might call pure energy.
Pure, the eternal youth.
Yes, the archetype of the eternal, often irresponsible youth. They see a culture where the modern individual avoids life's necessary hardships, demands universal rights without taking on corresponding responsibilities, and sort of expects a mommy state or a therapeutic culture to coddle and protect them from difficulty.
Like Peter Pan refusing to grow up.
Something like that. The pure seeks constant novelty, excitement, perhaps transgression, like in some modern art, but shies away from the senex qualities, the archetype of the old, wise, disciplined elder qualities like rigor, structure, logical maturity, saturnine work.
There's sometimes a sense in this critique of a kind of mass regression, waiting for some disciplined hero figure to emerge and break the spell.
That's a pretty stinging assessment of modern character.
Yeah.
But the Jungian model also uses the Poor-Senex archetypes, doesn't it? But sees them differently.
Crucially differently. For Jungians, the Poor-Senex dynamic isn't just a modern problem. It's a constant necessary polarity, a cycle throughout history. Both energies are essential.
So the problem isn't the pure itself. The problem, from a Jungian perspective like Ortega's critique, isn't the pure energy, but Giegerich's apparent overvaluation of the senex, the rigor, the logic, the saturnine discipline, while seemingly wanting to eliminate the necessary balancing energy of the pure.
Which brings what? Intuition, renewal.
Exactly. Intuition, spontaneity, renewal, magic in the sense of transformative potential. Ortega warns that an extreme bias towards only the senex without the balancing pure leads to rigidez cadaverica, a kind of cadaverous rigidity, an intellectual rigor mortis, a fascism of the intellect, he calls it.
So that impulse to become a magical being that Jung talked about
Is the pure archetype urging renewal, providing the spark, the very force that prevents consciousness from becoming completely static, historically ossified, and dead. It's vital.
So Giegerich demands intellectual maturity by accepting historical logic, even if it feels cold. Jungians argue true maturity means integrating both the structure and the magic, the senex and the pure, maintaining that vertical link to the archetypal. That's a huge difference.
It determines everything about how you approach suffering and neurosis. For Giegerich, neurosis seems to stem from failing to accept the logical historical necessity of the loss of a dendridad. For Jungians, neurosis comes from the ego, disrespecting the soul's need for symbolic life, forcing the unconscious to erupt with symptoms that demand transformation. They're fundamentally fighting over where reality truly lies, in the objective historical logos, or in the subjective depths of the living psyche.
Okay, we've laid out the core tension really clearly now. On one side, Giegerich calls for radical acceptance, logical integration. Basically, go home, stop the frantic searching, understand that the symbol's work is done, and learn to live within the logical categories consciousness has now evolved.
Accept the historical reality.
On the other side, the Jungian perspective demands something very different. Confrontation with the unconscious, the active pursuit of a renewed symbolic life. Search for your personal grail, explore the limits of your soul, because the loss of that vinculo, that link, is a call to evolve into a higher state of consciousness.
Embrace the symbolic imperative.
So what are the ultimate implications of these two paths for someone listening today, someone wrestling with this very search?
They offer profoundly different kinds of solace or challenge. The Giegerichian path offers, I think, a kind of stark intellectual liberation. It potentially frees you from the neurosis of the search itself by asking you to accept the perhaps cold, hard logos of our current historical age. It's a form of resignation, maybe, but one that could bring a certain intellectual peace. You integrate the transcendent not as an external goal, but as a logical quality within your own thinking structure.
But the Jungian path fundamentally insists that the libido, the life force, the deep yearning, the anhelo, isn't just a logical category you can dissolve with thought.
Exactly. That anhelo is psychic energy. And energy, as the first law of thermodynamics tells us, cannot be destroyed, only transformed.
So it has to go somewhere.
It will find expression. The libido will seek new forms, se sublima, se transforma. Whether that's through passionate artistic creation, or intense political or revolutionary conviction, or deep personal psychological or spiritual transformation, it will relentlessly seek its teleological goal.
Which is?
The realization of the self, the innate pattern of wholeness, the psyche's image of God, however you conceive that. The unconscious is always active, always pushing. As the famous Jungian saying goes, often attributed to the Delphic oracle via Erasmus, vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus haeret. Called or not called, the God will be present.
So trying to deny that fundamental yearning
is simply to guarantee it will erupt elsewhere, often in distorted, painful, neurotic forms. The energy has to flow.
So we're left with this fundamental conflict. The potentially cold, rigorous logic of Senex history versus the potentially chaotic but warm, transformative magia of the pure psyche.
It's a battle over how to interpret and live with modern disencanto, the disenchantment of the world. Is the feeling of flatness or meaninglessness we often experience today a sign of mature, logical acceptance of historical reality? Or is it itself a neurotic defense, a symptom of our failure to do the terrifying but necessary inner work of spiritual and symbolic transformation?
Which brings it all back to you, the listener. This deep dive into Giegerich versus Jung, it really highlights something profound, doesn't it? Our hyper-modern world, all of the digital tech, the bullet trains, the sophisticated science, it's still completely interwoven with these ancient, mythic elements it often claims to have moved beyond.
Absolutely. The patterns persist.
Even the sophisticated intellectual rejection of myth, like Giegerich's powerful analysis, is itself just a new historical movement, another turn of the great cyclical wheel of the ages.
A new myth about the end of myths, perhaps.
So the question for you, listening now, remains deeply personal. When your own search for meaning starts to feel exhausting, maybe circular, maybe even banal, what do you do? Will you choose the Giegerichian path of logical integration? Will you try to let that sense of loss, even futility, penetrate your consciousness, accept it as a historical fact, perhaps find peace in that acceptance? Or will you listen differently? Will you listen for that subtle, maybe unsettling, mythic call from your own unconscious? The call that demands a transformation, maybe a difficult journey, toward becoming your own version of the daughter of the moon, finding a symbolic role that feels profoundly, uniquely true for your soul, even if it defies conventional logic. knowing that the real encounter, the real source of vital meaning, might lie precisely in that confrontation with the unknown depths within.